All right, so I don't actually have a PowerPoint. By the time I remembered about it, it was too late, and then I figured I probably wouldn't keep up with it anyway, so I wasn't gonna actually go for that. I will say too, if I get lost, you might bail me out. I went and put my lesson together in a kind of a different way, and came back and looked at the questions after I had already done all my notes, and thought, wow, I could have just went through the questions, because it kind of leads you throughout this chapter pretty well. And so one thing that I like about these classes is answering the questions and getting other people's feedback and hearing from them. And so that was something I kind of wanted to do, except that I didn't plan it that way, and we'll probably just speak right over them and give the answers anyways. But I'll keep an eye on the questions, and if we can touch on them, then I'd like to do that. I think there's some good questions in here, especially the answering denominational error. There's some good things in here. And so chapter 18 flows really well, goes together. It's coming off the end of chapter 17, which ended how? Anybody recall what Jesus was talking about there at the end of 17? Right. Second coming. So I wasn't here Sunday. I assume Nevin just crushed it, and so I'm not going to rehash any of that. But coming off of that judgment, Jesus is going to tell them and use a couple of parables that are kind of go hand in hand here. For any of those that are preparing for that judgment, the type of attitude that it's going to take, and the kind of the demeanor, the thinking less of self, being humble, being a servant, right? All of that is built throughout this chapter, especially as we look about praying. So coming off of that day of judgment, anybody that's going to be preparing for that judgment, he tells them, look, you got to be praying, right? And he uses this parable of persistence to demonstrate that. And so who is he still speaking to here? Yeah, the disciples. The same ones that he addressed in verse 22 of chapter 17. The disciples. He's still talking to the disciples. And so the point of this parable is to... What's the point of this parable? Mostly, if you're going to sum it up in maybe 2 words or whatever. Yeah, persistence. Persistence in prayer, right? Pray always. You know, Jesus isn't just saying that it would be good to pray, right? If we may read it that way, but rather it's necessary. I think when I looked at these, some of the Greek words, it was that it's necessary, it's obligation, just like we would have an obligation to law. And so it goes beyond that. It's good to pray, and it's similar to Paul's teaching to the Thessalonians in chapter 5 and verse 17, to pray without ceasing, right? It's this continual idea of prayer. Why might that be important? I don't know if that's a question or not. When we think of the idea of prayer, those that have been able to make it a continual habit, what benefit does that provide to you?
The meditation time for me also. It helps me remember when the God is in charge, and I have to go to Him for everything that I need or want, to have happen. And 2, it keeps me grounded at all times.
Yeah. It puts everything into that focus, right? That puts God on our mind and centers everything around Him. It shows our devotion to Him, our complete trust, our complete need for Him, right? Scott?
It's a barometer on the strength that you're at. If you ever think of a time, if you're weak, you're not praying a lot. If you feel stronger,
if you think about, if you consider, I was going to say practice, right? The more you pray, you're essentially practicing. If you think about the way you might pray as somebody that might, if you consider yourself have been a faithful member for a long time, if you consider the prayers that you might say now compared to when you first became a Christian, they're much different, right? The focus is different. The level of respect, the level of humility, all of that's different. So it also provides a level of practice and a barometer, like you mentioned.
Great privilege, too. Sometimes we forget, we could pick up the phone anytime we wanted and call the president or whomever that's an important person that we would do. There's no one. She can talk to the creator of the world that actually breathed into existence everything we see, and you get to talk to him. You get to petition him. What a great privilege, but sometimes we forget how wonderful an honor that is.
Right, I agree. There is I think we can all stop and be thankful that we can go to God in prayer. We don't have to make some sort of animal sacrifice, especially that we can ask for that type of forgiveness wherever we are, right? If we have that right type of heart. I thought about James chapter 4 and verse 3 here when I was thinking about practicing and considering what it is to pray. In verse 3, he says, you ask, chapter 4 and verse 3 of James, he says, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. And you compare that to chapter 5 and verse 16 where he says, later in that verse, the prayer of the righteous person has great power as it is working. As the ESV says there. And so there is obviously a right way to go to God in prayer and a wrong way to go to God in prayer. And that's going to be demonstrated in the later part of this parable here. Not necessarily to do with the judge and the widow, but more the Pharisee and the publican. I lost my place. Let me get back over there. Okay, so in this prayer we have this parable, we have two kind of comparisons here. We have the judge who is neither God-fearing nor a respecter of persons, right? I remember reading this parable long ago when I had first become a Christian and thinking that the judge here is some sort of representation to God. I didn't finish reading the parable apparently because it's an exact contrast that if we can look at what this judge can do for this widow, then what more can our God, who is just, who is caring, who is loving, do for us, right? And so it's a direct contrast to God. Here we have this judge. He only cares about himself. He only cares about his social status. He's really bothered by this widow. And, it's likely that this judge was Jewish because they were able to rule over themselves under Roman authority. And so considering that, if you think about the requirements of a judge in Exodus and Leviticus, they are to, they're to fear God, right? It's the exact opposite of the judge that we see here. We think about God himself. He administers justice for the fatherless and the widows. And I thought it'd be important to keep in mind that James says we are to protect this class of person, right? The fatherless, the widows, as they don't have anybody to look out for themselves. So this widow certainly here in this parable is worthy of justice. She's worthy to be protected. And one of the questions says, let's see, I kind of already mentioned how judge and God are contrasted here, but what do you got? What does somebody have on that? I think I have more on that later, but that's question number 2. Yeah. Yeah. So if you hear Posey, she said that, God is one that has compassion, love, mercy, which is direct opposite of what the judge here had. So he does end up doing a good deed. And question number 3 says, what moved the judge to answer the widow's request? Yeah, the persistence, right? He figured, well, I'm just going to be bothered by this person again, so I'll give in and grant her what she wants. And so that persistence is, again, the point of this parable, that persistence in prayer, which is going to enable us to receive these blessings. And so, yeah, he only gave because of his, he says, his own weary, maybe having to deal with her again. It was from a completely selfish point of view, right? Whereas God, on the other hand, he wants us to come to him over and over again, right? It's, he's saying here it's a requirement to come to him over and over again. We're not going to be bothering him, and yet he's going to offer an even better justice. So there's a couple of things we can take from this. We can be like the widow, right? Persistence in coming to God. We can see what God says about this evil judge versus what God's going to offer us. And then continuing down in that parable, we see that God will vindicate. That's question number 4. And then also to be watchful and faithful for blessings and or judgment. We are to ask for these and be watchful for them. And so question number 4, what does avenge his elect mean? Yeah. Right. To not grow weary in that can be a difficult thing when you see what goes on around you, and whatever struggles you might have. Now, I think that most of us can put our life in perspective. Even the poorest in the United States have a lot more than what these Israelites had, especially a lot more than what other countries have. And so, but because we become used to that, I think we can grow weary. I think that when we don't get the answer that we thought we were seeking, can cause us to grow weary. And he tells them here, don't worry about those things. God's going to provide. God's going to give justice. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, in verse 6 there, he says, since it is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you, and to give you who are troubled rest with us when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. And so Paul is telling them, look, God's going to provide justice. God's going to give you rest. Don't become weary in this. Continue to pray. Continue to uphold the faith. And I had an example of David in many of the Psalms where he's asking for that vindication, something that they certainly would have been aware of as well. And so the New King James Version says, delay long there. So when we think of the elect being sinners, then we understand if it's us, the elect, the Christians, and consider our own life, all have sinned, right? Then that helps us understand the patience of God with us. If you think of David, he chose David to be king, right? Yet he faltered, right? He had sin, but God knew his heart, right? God knew his heart. But he continued to cry out day and night in prayer. Again, we have Paul telling us that he's not slack concerning his promises in 2 Peter. And then as far as time goes, we think that we don't get the response quick enough. he also says, one day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. When you try to put a time constraint on God that has no time constraint, right? Bounds like that, then, yeah, you may be frustrated. Can you think of any examples, Old Testament examples of men of faith whose prayers were answered, but probably different than they expected? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like Larry said, talking about Paul praying 3 times, sometimes the answer is no, right? So, sometimes it's not what you expected. I always think of, for whatever reason, when I think of prayers being answered in a different way than what I would have thought of, I think of Joseph, right? If I went to bed tonight and God said, you're going to be a ruler over your brothers, I'm thinking that's coming. Showing my impatience, I'm thinking next day, let's go. But it wasn't the case with Joseph. He went through a lot of suffering to get to that coming true. And even when it did come true, it probably looked much different than what he had imagined. And so I think that's a good example as well. All right, so before I go to the Pharisee and the tax collector, did anybody have any questions on that, David? Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly what you're going to see as he continues with another parable here that goes along with this. You have 2 very different people, right? You have a Pharisee and a tax collector. Did you have something? Oh, no, go ahead. I'm just going to continue. Yeah. Yeah. For whatever reason, that reminded me of, and I don't even know, I think maybe in Romans chapter 5 where Paul is quoting, I think Isaiah, where he says, all day long I've held my hands out to a disobedient people. He wanted them to come to him. He wanted them to ask for his help instead of them putting their faith in themselves, right? And so I think you see that through the same, kind of this next parable as well. Any more comments on that? Okay. All right, so going on to the Pharisee and the tax collector. I did find it interesting that Matthew doesn't tell this parable. Maybe it would reduce the impact of, some of the point of it being humility for a tax collector to tell this parable. Who knows? But I found that interesting. So he's going to contrast this first parable where trust and service must be placed in God to an example of one who appears to do what is required plus some, but approaches it with the wrong heart, like you were mentioning, without humility, He was comfortable in his own righteousness, and to a point where because he was comfortable in his own status, his own righteousness, it caused him to do what? To look down on others, right? He's going to look down essentially on this tax collector. And so he may have been righteous in all these, requirements, or going beyond what was required here of the law, but he lacked the correct spiritual qualities. And so you've got two very different people here. You've got a Pharisee who would be sort of, in that time thought of as maybe the more quote-unquote righteous, the one that upholds all the laws, versus a tax collector who is typically going to be despised, considered a cheat, because some of them would tax more than they were supposed to and keep back the extra. And so you got two different, very, very different people here who pray in two very different ways and have two very different outcomes. Maybe the opposite of what people would have thought as well. He says, speaking of righteousness in Ezekiel 33, that the prophet there, I thought was very fitting for this example. In verse 13 of Ezekiel 33, he says, "When I say to the righteous that he shall surely live, but he trusts in his own righteousness and commits iniquity, none of his righteous works shall be remembered, but because of the iniquity that he has committed, he shall die." So, despite all the extra things that we think we might be doing or going above and beyond, if we don't approach it with the right attitude, none of that stuff is going to matter, right? It's keeping the whole body of work here and leaning on God, leaning on His grace and mercy. In Matthew chapter 7, He says, "Not everyone that calls on me, Lord, Lord, will inherit the kingdom." It's a scary verse, I think, probably for all of us from time to time. Think, when you consider, am I doing enough? Am I doing what I'm supposed to? Do I have the right attitude? Because that will be the case for some. And so when we look at the characteristics of their prayers, they are vastly different. If you consider the Pharisee, well, let's go ahead and answer number 5. Whoever wants to take number 5, go ahead and knock out A, B, and C. What kind of attitude did the Pharisee display toward God, toward himself, and towards the tax collector? Yeah. Right. It's one of those looks good on paper, maybe, type of thing. If you've ever done interviews, right? Looks good on paper, and then you get to talk to them, and you're like, oh, no. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, he's looking to really justify himself. Jesus had already kind of condemned him for that in chapter 16, for calling them hypocrites. We see that he stands. Not necessarily anything wrong with that, but just more kind of lending itself to his attitude, to his demeanor. He's applauding himself. He does what I think a lot of people do, and I'm not excluding myself, compares himself to others. And when he does that, he compares himself to who? Like sinners, right? Rather than, he could, if you're going to compare yourself to someone, maybe faithful men, maybe Jesus, for example. See how you stack up. But anyways, he compares himself to men who Paul already said have no place in the kingdom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he specifically mentions all of these adulterers and such who already have no place in the kingdom. So it doesn't do any good, the irony there of comparing himself to those people. He says, I fast twice a week, I give tithes. How often were they supposed to fast? You recall? Yeah, once a year, Day of Atonement. So fasting twice a week, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. We see that examples of the disciple or the apostles fasting, Jesus fasting, these could have been notable works, right? These could have been things that were good, but again, the attitude was wrong. Paul and Barnabas fast before preaching. They fasted before the elders were appointed. And like I said, Jesus fasted, but he also taught the right way to fast too, right? In Matthew chapter 16. I think we talked about that in past classes, about them, the Pharisees kind of disfiguring their faces. They wanted to be seen as fasting. They wanted to kind of have that notoriety of, look at what we do. We keep the law. We go above and beyond, right? And so everything there could have been okay, but again, the wrong attitude. The giving of tithes, again, what portion were they supposed to give? A tenth, right? Larry, did you have something? Larry, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm guessing what you're saying, and I'm a bad lip reader. Oh, okay. Yeah, pride, right? Did you see the signs, pride becomes before the fall, this last month?
It's almost like he's going into the room and he's sat in one of the chief seats and he's spending his time telling God why he deserves to be there, rather than asking for mercy. He reads his resume.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not, had he kept all of the law perfectly, even then he shouldn't brag about it. But of course he did not, binding on those things that were traditions of men, and reads them off as if God owes him favor, which he does not.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It was the same case for giving a tithes. I believe they not only gave of their own income, but also of their purchases, which then again those who received that money would have tithed to. So it was this extra above and beyond. And even in that time, I had read that was seen as extreme as well, of all this extra giving. And Jeremiah had just talked about the type of giving that we are commanded to give. We don't have any specific example of how much. We read that they were to give a tenth, and so we can at least start there as this baseline. But I think one of the most important pieces of that is the attitude, right? It's cheerful, right? Is what Paul tells the Corinthians. A cheerful attitude. And so that would go against what likely this Pharisee was doing. He's looking for recognition. But we contrast that to the publican, and like you had just mentioned, I don't know if there's any significance on where they're standing, but we read that he's standing afar off. He's much different in his posture. He's not right up there against maybe what they would consider a more holy area, more preferred area. He's standing afar off. He's standing back. Maybe give some credence to his humility, that he may feel that he's not even worthy to come all the way into the temple. And that's just, I don't know, probably conjecture on my part, but maybe there's some importance there. But he wouldn't even lift his eyes to heaven, right? He's going to have his head down. He's not even going to lift his eyes. Would that be a problem, lifting your eyes to heaven? We see that David in, where did I go? In one of the Psalms. So I contrasted this with David here in Psalms 123, in those first 3 verses, where David did do that. He looked up to heaven in his prayer. And so it's not necessarily anything wrong with this, but it's just, again, a reflection of his humility. He beats on his chest. What's in our chest? Dr. Bo, what's in our chest? A heart. But that's what I think of. You're beating on your chest. You're covering your heart. Again, just showing that level of humility, that prayer of confession. He acknowledges that he's a sinner. I did want to mention, though, can we come to God in prayer boldly? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the whole lesson that it's trying to do, and remember from Luke 17 in our lesson on Sunday. Increase our faith. Well, if you're going to increase your faith, look at these parables and look at what your heart and your mind is going to have to be set on and change to. Forget about yourself and depend on God. And that's really the theme in these parables that we're studying tonight, is you forget about yourself and you depend on God. Whatever his answer is, I think Jeremiah did a phenomenal job on the lesson on prayer, is forget ourselves. God's answering our prayer. It may not be, as you stated, how we want to hear it, but hopefully it's increasing our faith and assisting us in being able to support our brothers and sisters in Christ in being a part of the kingdom and getting to heaven.
Yeah, exactly. Terry. Yeah, that's exactly what I had too. Is he calling himself a sinner was the exact same language as Paul refers to himself as the chief sinner, right? Acknowledging that you spoke about Ephesians, but earlier in Ephesians chapter 2, that humility of understanding that apart from God's grace and mercy, we are sinners, right? And that's the attitude that the tax collector displayed here, Larry. Yeah. Yeah, he had already, backing up to Luke, I don't even know what chapter it was, but where he had taught them how to pray, right? And going along with that, he tells a similar parable to this first one, right? About the neighbor coming for, I think, 3 loaves of bread and being persistent, right? Understanding that that persistence, that need, that God is the one that provides, and giving it all to him. Making sure I didn't skip over anything here. Okay, does anybody have anything else on that?
Humility is hard to have when things are going your way, and easy to have when
Yeah.
You know, we're certain we can't think of better than God, but we can't think of better than anybody, that's for sure.
Right. It's that, again, that teaching of becoming servants, right? Nobody beneath you type of attitude. And I got to move. Let the children come to me. So there's a thought question on this. Anybody answer number 2 on the denominational error about Luke 18:16 being proof that infants can be citizens in the kingdom of God and therefore practice infant baptism? What does the Bible teach about infant baptism? In like 5 seconds, just answer that question.
He's not talking about their spirituality and pure knowledge. He's talking about their heart is pure and innocent. And that we need to have that same kind of heart. He's trying to tell us we need to be like these little children. It's not saying that they are members of his kingdom.
Yeah.
It's saying this is the way that people in my kingdom will be.
Yeah, it's a complete misunderstanding of what's being taught here. If you compare it to with the parables that were before, it's, again, that attitude, right? If you think about children, we've all been around children. We think about their qualities. And I will say that Matthew and Mark's accounts teach this coming off the heels of an adulterous relationship, and so family may have been on the mind at that point. But Luke records it as kind of this orderly account here going along with these. It's about how children are, and we see them bringing babies to them. That was a common practice. Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to Simeon, right, and to Anna to be prayed to be blessed. We see that Jesus, did take them into their arms in the other accounts and touch them. And so there is a lot here. There's a lot of good information to combat that question if you just study it. I can't get into it at this time, but there's some Greek word studies and things on where this children and things like that are used that are very good that completely disprove that argument. And so I didn't really want to get into all of that. I wanted to see who can answer that really fast, and so I think you did a good job. But yeah, it's just, simply put, it's a misunderstanding of what is being taught here. It's more about how children react. Right, and possess those same attributes. Some of the qualities I had is, children love pretty freely, don't they? They react humbly. They're very trusting. There's an innocence that comes with them. They desire to be with a caring guardian, right? God. And they desire structure. They desire rules. Whether they tell you that or not, everybody desires structure, desires some set of rules. And so, flying past that, but I had a lot on the rich ruler. Probably not going to make it through all of that. But here again, we see somebody who is doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's kept the law. He's done all these things. But Jesus is going to challenge him, right? He knows his heart. And what's he tell him to do? Yeah, to give all that he has. He calls on him to give up something, to give away something, and to give in to something, to come to him for rest. It goes along with these other parables of putting aside our own thoughts, our own perceived righteousness, and leaning completely on God, which is going to require a sacrifice. Now, does he require all of us to sell all of our possessions? No, possibly, right. But it hasn't been we don't read a direct command to do that. But the point here is that there may be that one thing that we all struggle with. There may be, work or a hobby or something like that may be standing in the way that we have to move aside. It gets you thinking, and I was thinking about this last night as I was going to bed. What is getting in the way for me? If I was able to speak to Jesus in this time, what is it that he's going to tell me to do, and how fast would I react on it? Would I hesitate or anything like that? Do I have time still? No? Okay. Well, sorry, guys. I hope that was enough. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll give you my notes. But yeah, appreciate it.